agencies, including prosecutorial agencies throughout the United States and its territory. So I spent the first 4 years of my career there investigating those kinds of allegations, taking them to court as necessary, and seeking court enforceable agreements to change patterns or practices when unlawful conduct was identified. After that, I did a short stint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was new at the time. And I focused in on allegations of discriminatory behavior by large banks and non-bank lending institutions. I spent not too long there. I've actually had 7 jobs in my last 10 years, so I will cut this short. I then joined the Los Angeles City Ethics Commission as the Director of Enforcement, where I directed investigators and attorneys in investigations of alleged illegal conduct by elected officials and appointed officials. I think the thread that ties each of the career choices that I've made together, one which reflects my background as a first-generation Latinx individual, is checking government authority with government authority. I've always been very attracted to the notion that in a democracy such as ours, you can use government power to point the finger at another government actor that is potentially stepping out of bounds. I think there is something very special about living in a community that tolerates that. If you try to do that in other places, in other times within the United States, things don't tend to go too well for you, your career, or your personal life. And there have been times where I have been the most unpopular person in the room. And I should correct that. That's always the case. But I have really seen the benefits of stepping into arenas that are difficult, such as this. And I know that each of the other panelists has that experience also. I spend my day-to-day now rebuilding the Office of Independent Review. It has been unstaffed for about 2 years. As I mentioned, these kinds of agencies tend to navigate choppy waters. So I'm reestablishing relationships with community stakeholders. I am working with the departments that are within my purview to reacquaint them with active oversight. And I am working with the Board of Supervisors who appointed me to ensure that the office is doing what it's doing. And so to me, it's very exciting work. The promise of systems work is that you can identify issues, identify causes, and through all sorts of tools within your legal and non-legal toolbox, you can create and enact solutions that will hopefully prevent the kinds of issues that you've spotted from ever taking place again. So thank you so much.
Actually, thank you. And that I feel like that segues perfectly into our main topic for today, which is reform, criminal justice reform. So as we speak, a global pandemic rages. Our country is roiled by protests over police killings of unarmed Black men and women. And it seems like the national conversation is finally focused on these issues of reform and rebuilding a deeply broken criminal justice system. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, yet nearly 25% of all prisoners, the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher than Russia and China. And we have a system that many would argue dehumanizes poor people and people of color, damages already marginalized communities, doesn't necessarily advance public safety in the way we want, and siphons public resources with what some would say is, little social benefit to them. So, it's clear that we are at a crisis point right now. And on this panel, we are so lucky, as we've just heard, to have each of you with expertise in a different facet of this system, from policing, pre-detention, through the trial process, incarceration, and post-release supervision. So I want to ask each one of you, and I think I'd like to start with Jorge and then Sergio, because you two have worked so much on policing issues, which is sort of the first point of contact often, the criminal justice system. I want to ask you, where do you see the greatest opportunity for reform? Where do you see the biggest obstacles? And how do we even begin to rebuild public trust in a system that has failed so many for so long? I'll let you take the first stab at this.
Yeah, in terms of where I see the opportunity, it, I think that for the first time, certainly in at least a couple of generations, you really see, kind of classical bipartisan support for the push for change, right? For the need for change, even before 2020, with all of the most recent protests against police brutality, there has been a kind of a gradual but meaningful movement from both, red state Republicans and blue state Democrats and certainly centrists in the middle towards re-examining what we're doing with our criminal justice system. I think on one end of the spectrum, there's the social justice component, which says that the way we're doing this is just simply wrong. It's wrong from a moralistic point of view. It's wrong from a justice point of view. And then on the other end, you have the point of view, which is like, well, this is just wasteful, right? We are expending so many public resources to do absolutely nothing with such a significant component of our society that couldn't those resources be better dedicated elsewhere, right? Even small government type folks who are just like, why are we funding so many damn prisons and jails? We could use that money to far more productive means. So you have this kind of unusual marriage of goals, even if they're not necessarily coming to it from the same perspective. So I think that's where the greatest opportunity comes, is trying to take advantage of the convergence of those two political streams. Where I think the liability potentially comes from is actually the emergence of this kind of counter to both of that, right? I think we're seeing in this country the kind of an emergence of this reactionary group that kind of opposes both the left and the right in many ways and is trying to forge their own path. And I think that from a political point of view, neither side, neither kind of the two established political parties or the organizations that have, been built up over the years and institutions that have been built up over the years in support of that or in response to that, really knows how to handle that, right? I mean, you have people who are, again, on all sides of the political spectrum, like occupying government buildings. And I think for the first time in a long time, the government doesn't know how to react. You have federal buildings being occupied. You have local police precincts being occupied, and I think there is a hesitancy to respond because no one knows what this like new emergent political force is going to do in response to it. And so I think the uncertainty surrounding that and the uncertainty surrounding how that force is going to react to even ostensibly bipartisan proposals for reform, I think that's going to cause a lot of people pause. And we'll just kind of have to see how that plays out in the long run.
So here, do you want to add to?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of the stage that Jorge has set. For me, the question of police reform is one that has become increasingly hyper local. As I mentioned before, I have shifted from federal, state to city and county, and I think because of the complexity of the issues and the systems at issue, the best solutions to me are ones that are deeply grounded in the immediate needs of discrete communities, which is in the United States, I think we have anywhere from 30 to 40,000 policing agencies of various types and sizes. You have local police departments that number no larger than 4. And what do effective policies and training regimes look like in an agency of that type versus LA County's Sheriff's Department, which has 10,000 law enforcement officers? To me, that points at a real need to step away from a one size fits all approach to policing reform and a need to adopt a careful examination of what's going on the ground. What are the issues in a particular community that need to be addressed, and who is best equipped? Who should we empower to address those kinds of issues? The promise of the current moment, to Jorge's point, and Mari, to your point in the lead-in, is that we are living through a particular cultural moment where people are reassessing what our justice system is supposed to be doing for us. And what I am increasingly encouraged by is the emphasis on human dignity and respect. The idea that our systems should be not just complying with the black letter of the law, but that they should be in each of their manifestations, paying respect to the human dignity that lives inside of all of us, regardless of the allegations at issue and regardless of where we find ourselves on any particular day. For most of us, interacting with law enforcement agencies is always going to be a fraught moment. And it means that we have to reassess the assumptions that we bring into that space. We have to assess the assumptions of what we believe a person accused of a very serious crime can lay claim to in terms of rights and treatment. I am most scared of losing this cultural moment because of the needs that have been brought to the forefront by various community groups, including Black Lives Matter and other similarly situated advocacy groups. I want to make sure that I do my part, especially in the local context, to ensure that agencies, government agencies like the Office of Independent Review, are receptive to the various voices at issue here. And as Jorge pointed out, I think that there's a real danger here that these needs that have been brought to the foreground won't be adequately addressed in a manner that is satisfying to folks. And that's why I go back to emphasizing the local context. The federal government will always be an attractive avenue because I think there's always this temptation that it's a one shot and you win type of situation. Well, if we get a federal law that says your use of force policy has to say X, Y, and Z, then we can feel satisfied now that things are going to be a-okay. But I think that the diversity of law enforcement agencies out there and the different needs of different communities really make that a fool's errand. So I would really encourage folks to focus in on the local opportunities that are available to them, to learn about the criminal justice system, and to become active participants in the kinds of conversations that are taking place now. The transparency that exists now when it comes to policing practices, I think, is the main driver of the issues that we're seeing today, from body cams on out. And in many ways, that makes all of us sort of a participant in the criminal justice system.
Now, Alicia, I want to turn to you next because you follow cases at every step of the trial process. And I'm wondering, from you're immersed in every step of trial, where are you seeing the greatest potential and the greatest obstacles?
Yes, I guess I'll start with the question that you asked last of Jorge, which is how do we rebuild trust in this system? And I just think we can't. We cannot rebuild trust in the system, and we should not trust the system. As a trial attorney, I meet people immediately after they've been arrested, and I'm with them all the way through, whether they plea or whether they go to trial and then a conviction or an acquittal. And what's become apparent in just this past 5 years is that, and I often deal with very serious cases, and what's become apparent is that the reason this system fails all of us is because it addresses violence after it has already taken place. And it does so in a punitive, dehumanizing way. It does not recognize, as Sergio said, the inherent human dignity in every person and the fact that one act does not define who you are. But not only to people facing charges, but also to victims of violent crime, who I have seen treated in ways that are just dehumanizing as well. They do not have an advocate the way that a defendant does, right? As Jorge mentioned earlier, like the prosecutors wield the power of the state for the state, and there's no attorney that represents the victim. And I can give you countless examples of situations where the individual who suffered harm does not want the other person harmed in return, does not want the parent of their child to go to prison, does not want their neighbor to be enmeshed in this system. But it's the only thing we have. And so I think our biggest opportunity right now with this current system is really a radical reimagination of what a justice system means. A shift away from this punitive system to a more transformative, like restorative justice situation. The biggest opportunity right now, I think, is the shifting of resources. As Sergio mentioned, with this like the Fund the Police movement, I just truly think there's so much money out there being used for after addressing violence after the fact, where communities where violence is taking place usually are suffering, and the roots of that violence comes from things that could be addressed with this money, such as improving public schools, access to mental health treatment, just some mediation sort of service, de-escalation centers. It's just shifting the money away from punishing people after something has taken place to trying to prevent the violence. And then even once the violence has taken place, shifting the money into preventing future violence, because sending somebody to prison is not going to make them it's going to make them more likely to reoffend. It's going to make them more traumatized. It's going to make them more likely to commit a violent crime in the future. And so just like focusing on alternatives to incarceration, getting rid of mandatory minimums. Often the reason why my clients cannot be placed in a program, even though the cause of the incident is so apparent, because of mental health issues or because of addiction issues or something along these lines, and the judge agrees, but because the prosecution will not agree and they control, because there's mandatory minimums and the judge can't offer something below that, then we're stuck in this situation where prison is the only option, prison or trial. And so I would say just really rethinking where money's going, and the fact that somebody should not be thrown away after they've done something that harms someone else, but restoring that person's mental health, creating more jobs so there's opportunities. I think the obstacles that I see to this is that there is money involved in benefiting from the current system. There's a prison industrial complex, and also police unions are very, very powerful. So I do see private interests like that pushing back against this narrative and trying to stall change.
Thank you. And looking at sort of the incarceration piece and the post-incarceration piece, Ryan, that's really your area of expertise, and I'm wondering how you respond to that. And also, somebody in the chat has asked a question while I have you about the subject of your academic paper.
Yeah, so the subject of the paper I'll be going on the academic market with is in this area of community supervision, which would include probation, parole, and post-release supervision. That's the focus of my research has been on those areas, as well as some work on solitary confinement. So some areas that do gain some attention from academic writing, but actually, especially community supervision, hasn't gotten a lot of attention from the legal scholarship. There's some other areas that have studied it quite intensely, but these are areas that are hugely important parts of the criminal justice system. And I like to frame it as, there's for obvious reasons, there's a lot of attention and concern surrounding mass incarceration and the racial disparities in mass incarceration. These probation and post-release supervision are these systems that are key factors in the flow of individuals into and out of that system, and kind of how people transition, or the reasons why we're sending people to jail and prison are really important things to understand and to look at, and at in the same way as all of these other parts of the system where we're hopefully seriously thinking about substantial reforms, and not just little changes around the edges. These are areas that we need to look at very closely as well. The solitary confinement piece, I'll just talk a little bit about the work that I've done on solitary confinement, because oftentimes we know the number of people that are in prison, but after that, it's sort of a black box. There's a little bit of more work on solitary confinement that's been happening more recently. But I have a piece with Jessica Symes in the Criminal Justice Policy Review. She's a sociologist at Boston University, and we we're able to look at, we have an administrative data set where we're able to look at solitary confinement in a particular state over the 90s into the 2000s, and there's an increase in the use of solitary confinement, and this is common. This has been found in kind of less